Welcome to chapter 6. This chapter, we're talking about the integumentary system, which is the system that is composed of the skin and all the associated structures. The skin and its accessory structure. So some of the accessory structures of the skin are structures like the hair, the nails, the glands, like your sweat glands, your oil glands, and your sensory receptors. All of those things together make up the integumentary system. So your skin is going to well, first of all, know that your skin is an organ. And it is the largest organ that we have in our bodies by weight. There are several different tissue types associated with the skin. So the information that we learned in the last chapter, chapter 5, tissues, we definitely need to know those because many of those, well, all of those will be associated with your skin. So make sure you're brushing up on chapter 5 so that you can understand those chapters when we reference them in the integumentary system chapter and other chapters. So another name for skin is the cutaneous membrane. Remember that a membrane is going to be basically a sheet of tissue that covers something else. So your skin is a sheet of tissue that covers your body. And we call it integumentary system or the integument, but we can also call it the cutaneous membrane. There are two layers of the cutaneous membrane. You have the epidermis and the dermis. So let's start with dermis. Dermis refers to the skin, excuse me, and that's going to be the inner layer or the deeper layer of the integumentary system. Then you have the epidermis. Remember, epi means above. So the epidermis is going to sit above or superficial to the dermis. That's going to be the outer layer of skin, the layer that we touch and feel and that our clothes sit on. That is the epidermis. So cutaneous membrane contains two layers. You have the epidermis, which is the outer or more superficial layer, and then the dermis, that is the deeper of the two layers. Epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. Epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. Remember that stratified squamous epithelium, or as all epithelial tissues have, there is a basement membrane that these stratified squamous epithelial cells are attached to. That is going to be the membrane that is between your epidermis and your dermis. So epidermis is all stratified squamous epithelium. The deepest portion of that is the basement membrane that separates the epidermis from the dermis. The dermis is going to be that deeper layer. It's going to be thicker than the epidermis. And the dermis is going to be made up of connective tissues. So connective tissues, you're also going to have collagenous and elastic fibers. You're going to have some muscle cells or muscle fibers. You're going to have blood vessels and blood, as well as nervous tissue. Now, remember when we talked about tissues, we said that epidermis or epithelial tissue, epithelial cells, they lack blood vessels, blood flow. They are avascular, and that the connective tissue was in general very vascular, had lots of blood flow associated with it. So here is an example of that. Your epidermis, the top layer of your skin or the most outer layer of your skin, has no blood vessels. This is why when you get a paper cut, you don't bleed because there are no blood vessels associated. If the cut is deep enough, even if it's still really shallow, if it's deep enough, then you'll start getting blood and you'll also start feeling pain because your dermis is where those nerve cells are. That's where the blood vessels are. So that's how, that's one way you can start to look at those cell layers, those tissue layers, and understand them inside the body. So cutaneous layer or your integumentary system is made up of epidermis and dermis, but whenever we talk about the skin, even though it is not directly a part of the integumentary system, it is always mentioned. You have the subcutaneous layer, also called the hypodermis or the hypodermic layer. Both of those are different names for the same structure. It is going to be a third layer of tissues deep to the dermis. So it's going to be mostly considered an insulation layer. You're going to have connective tissue, so areolar connective tissue, as well as adipose tissue. So we have, uh, once you start to see that adipose tissue or that fat, deep to the skin, you know that you're getting into that subcutaneous layer, as well as it having, of course, that areolar connective tissue. As I mentioned, it is not considered part of the skin. It is not considered a part of the integumentary system, but we always talk about it because it's so closely related. You also have lots of vasculature in that subcutaneous layer, and that can also help to supply the epidermis with nutrients from the blood. So here is an image of a microscope slide of the subcutaneous, I'm sorry, of the integumentary system. So at the top of the slide of the image, you have what's called stratified squamous epithelium. So all of this tissue that is this darker pinkish reddish color, that is going to be your your stratified squamous epithelium. All of this, even this layer on top. This is all part of your stratified squamous epithelium. You have the basement membrane. Remember, the basement membrane is going to be the deepest part of this stratified squamous epithelium, and the deepest of these cells are going to sit on that basement membrane. The basement membrane is also going to be what separates the epidermis from the dermis. So this lighter pink color is going to be your dermis. You'll notice here that it says dense irregular connective tissue. So remember, dense irregular means that you have those cells that are tightly packed together, but they don't have a uniform construction. They're not all uniform in the way that they're laying down. So that's why it looks sort of disjointed. You see all of these white lines. It's not wavy or straight. That is that dense, irregular connective tissue. Then deep to that, you have adipose tissue. So remember when we looked at adipose tissue, they were large cells that looked very white or empty, but the nuclei were pushed off to the side because there was so much adipose or fat stuffed in each cell that it basically pushed all of the other substance of the cells out of the way. And the nucleus is going to be the easiest portion to see. So all of these white portions here are adipose cells. And then you have the other tissues associated with this subcutaneous layer here. So another micrograph here and another image. So when you look at images like this, you want to make sure that you look at both the drawing as well as the micrograph. The drawing is going to usually be more clear to help you see the structures more easily. But then the micrograph is going to show you what it actually looks like in the body when you look under a microscope slide at these structures. So the integumentary system plus the subcutaneous layer, you have most superficial, you have your epidermis. So this pink or darker purplish color here is going to be your epidermis along with these cells superficial to them. So all of that is considered your epidermis. It's going to be sitting on this basement membrane, and this basement membrane is not uniform all the way through. So keep that in mind, that the basement membrane is not going to be a straight structure. It's going to be layered, and it have different heights and depth, depends on where it is. Deep to that, you have your dermis and all of the associated structures. And then deep to that, where you start seeing that adipose tissue, is your subcutaneous layer. So here, we don't really see that subcutaneous layer very much, but I would say it's probably going to be down here, subcutaneous layer. You have your hair, you have your dermis, which in the image is going to be blue, and your epidermis is going to be this purple color. Now, this hair has epidermal tissues closely associated with it, and then that dermis tissue associated with it a little bit deeper. So that's because of the way it's structured, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so epidermis. You also have some epidermis around this hair shaft. Then you have dermis that's deep to that, and some dermis that's going to dip into where the hair shaft goes, and then your subcutaneous layer or adipose tissue. So let's talk more about the epidermis. The epidermis, as we mentioned, is composed of stratified squamous epithelium. It lacks blood vessels because that is a characteristic of epithelial tissues. The deepest layer of the epidermis is called the stratum basale. Stratum basale. So stratum, we want to think of as a layer, right? So stratum would be like a layer. Basale, to me, that word sounds like base. So that is going to be the base layer or the deepest layer of the epidermis. This layer is going to be nourished by the blood vessels that are located in the dermis. So again, epithelial tissue does not have blood vessels associated with it. It gets nourishment from the layers deep to it, the connective tissues deep to it. And since the stratum basale is the deepest layer of the epidermis, it's going to be the layer that's closest to the dermis, and it be the first layer of the epidermis that receives nourishment from those blood vessels. As cells grow, they migrate toward the free surface away from the nutrient supply. So new cells begin in the stratum basale. New cells in the epidermis begin in the stratum basale, and then as they grow, they get bigger, they start to learn their job a little bit better. And again, as they get older, they get pushed toward the surface. That's why it says that they migrate toward the free surface. So they get pushed toward the surface, so they get pushed superficially away from that nutrient supply. And then as they migrate toward the surface and get older, they start to have more keratin associated with each cell. So keratin, those cells become keratinocytes, meaning cells that have keratin. As they move closer and closer to the surface and they get more and more keratin, they start to flatten out and die. As they flatten, they become more squamous shaped and die. So remember, they're moving further away from the stratum basale, which is that layer that's closest to the nutrient supply in the dermis. So as they move further and further away, they have less and less nutrients available, and that's part of the reason why they die. So keratinization. Keratinization is the process of a cell becoming harder, starting to dehydrate and accumulate more and more keratin inside the cell. So as these cells start to migrate from the stratum basale to more superficial layers, they will add more and more keratin, and because of that, they'll start to harden they'll start to dry out, and that is also going to help them die and become the cells that we know of as the skin, or what we see as the skin. So keratin is going to be a tough, fibrous, waterproof protein that is made by and stored in the cells. This tough, fibrous, waterproof protein is why our skin is waterproof. Why, when water falls on our skin, it doesn't directly absorb into our bodies. Because if that were to happen, we would always be waterlogged, and that would cause other problems. As the cells reach the outer surface, they become tightly packed. They develop desmosomes. Remember, desmosomes are going to be those spot wells. And they form the outermost layer of the epidermis, and that's going to be the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum. So the deepest layer of the epidermis is the stratum basale. The outermost or most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. So whenever we touch our skin, we're touching dead, flattened, keratinized cells that have been hardened and dehydrated, waterproof, right? And so that is going to be what makes up the stratum corneum. Eventually, the stratum corneum cells do shed from the skin surface. That's why whenever you hear commercials about dust and dust in the air, dust on the ground, cleaning your bed and things like that, and like how often you should wash your sheets, your pillowcases, your pillows, and things like that, it's because there are dead, sloughed off skin associated with those, because that stratum corneum layer is always shedding off. And that's why our skin basically maintains its same level of thickness, unless there is some problem with the shedding. And we'll talk about that later. The thickest parts of our skin, or the thickest skin on our body, is found in the palms of our hand and the soles of our feet. Of course, the soles of our feet are going to be even thicker than the palms of our hand, and that's basically as a protector. So the stratum corneum is going to be thicker in the feet, the soles of the feet, because that is going to be the part of the body that has the most trauma. You're always walking on your feet. You always have pressure from the entire body on your feet. And to protect those structures, you have a thicker layer of stratum corneum. And in the palms of the hand, it's not going to be as thick as the bottom of the feet, because you're not walking on your hands. But because we do so much with our hands, we still have thick skin on that part of our body, so that we are protected from all of the things that we're touching and passing by, feeling on, etc. Most of the rest of the body has thinner epidermis. So the epidermis on the palms and soles will run from 0.8 to 1.5 millimeters. Now, when you look at a ruler, you'll know that this is still extremely thin, right? 0.8 to 1.5 millimeters is still pretty thin, but it's much thicker than the rest of the body. On the rest of the body, the, the size or the thickness of the epidermis will range from 0.07 to 0.12. 0.07 to 0.12, still much, much thinner than what's on the palms and soles. All right. The functions of the epidermis are to protect against water loss. So think about people who have been burned. When someone goes to a burn unit and they have lots of the percentage of their body has been burned, that epidermis is damaged. So those patients have to be protected from dehydration, because there's no keratin left. All of the structures that are deep to your integumentary system have the ability to be dried out because of the air that is passing over the body and the water wanting to leave. It also protects against harmful chemicals. So if there are any chemicals that are touching your body, you're largely protected from it, unless it's caustic and it burns through that epidermal layer. When it burns through, then you know it's a problem because then it can get through any layer. But harmful chemicals, mechanical injury, meaning physical touch injury, whether it's a bruise or a cut or something like that, you're being protected by your epidermis. And you're also being protected from pathogens. So there's always something in the air. There's always bacteria and other pathogens on the surfaces that we touch, that we sit on, that we lay on, and that epidermis is protecting us from all of those. For those of you who are visual learners, you can use this graph as a quick snapshot of what we're talking about in the epidermis. So let's talk about all of the layers of the epidermis. We talked about the deepest layer. We talked about the most superficial layer. So let's go from deep to superficial and fill in the gaps. The stratum basale, or the basal cell layer, is going to be the deepest layer. It's going to look like a single row of cuboidal or columnar cells that divide and grow. So remember last chapter, we said that whenever you have a layer of tissue that is more than one layer, so we had simple squamous and stratified squamous. This is stratified squamous. So when we have that stratified squamous, the deepest layer of cells is not going to look like the most superficial layer. So you don't want to use the deepest layer to try to identify that layer of of epithelial tissue. In this particular case, they may look cuboidal, they may look columnar, but they're still that deepest layer of the epidermis. And these are the cells that divide and grow. So your skin is growing from the stratum basale. This is also the layer that contains your melanocytes. So melanocytes are the cells that produce melanin, and melanin is going to be that layer of, I'm sorry, those cells that produce pigment. Everyone has melanin. Every single body on Earth has melanin. There are different types of melanin, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And there are different amounts of melanin being produced, but everyone has it. Okay. So everyone's melanocytes are going to be in this deepest layer of the epidermis, which is the stratum basale. Next layer of epidermis, or the next superficial layer, above the stratum basale, or superficial to the stratum basale, is the stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum. This is many layers of cells, many layers of cells. So stratum basale is only one layer of cells that are going to look cuboidal or columnar. But then superficial to that one layer, you're going to have many layers located or associated with the stratum spinosum. These cells will be they will have centrally located and large oval nuclei. So you'll start to see the nuclei being in the center of the cell, and usually have a more oval shape than round shape. These cells will start developing fibers of keratin. So once they leave this stratum basale, that's when they start to keratinize. They begin the keratinization process, and they start to flatten. They start to look more like the squamous cells that we know they are. So superficial to that, we have the stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum. These cells are going to be, this layer is going to be about 3 to 5 cell layers thick. They're going to be much more flattened. They're going to have what looks like granules inside. And these granules are basically going to be those keratin fibers, more and more keratin fibers. So as you see more keratin fibers, they'll start to look like little grains. And that's why this is the granulosum, right? So flattened granular cells that contain shrunken fibers of keratin and shriveled nuclei. So as you get to the stratum granulosum, these cells are going to start to die, and that's why the nuclei is shriveling up. Then superficial to that, you might have the stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. Now, not every epidermis has stratum lucidum. Not every location where you find epidermis on the body is going to have stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is only going to be located in thick skin. So, stratum lucidum, you'll only find it in the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. These cells will appear clear. So if you look up the term or you look at the term lucidum, you start to see lucid. Okay, you start to see lucid. Make sure you look up lucid so you can understand the word a little bit deeper than what I'm about to say. When we say lucid, we mean clear. So if someone has lucid dreams, if you've heard that phrase before, I had lucid dreams, or you take this medication and you may have more lucid dreams. When they say lucid, they mean clear. These are dreams that you can actually remember because they are so clear. So the stratum lucidum is going to be a layer. So remember, stratum means layer of clear cells. So cells appear clear. The nuclei, organelles, and cell membranes are no longer visible. In these cells, you cannot see any of those structures. Remember, these cells started to die as they moved from that deepest layer to the more superficial layer. All right, so you can no longer see those structures. And then the most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. So we have in corneum, we can see the word corn. What I want you to think about are corns on the feet. So when we talk about a person has corns on their feet, we usually talk about them having thick layers of skin in portions of their feet. And that's what basically corny means in this regard. So the stratum corneum is going to be that thick outermost layer of skin, and it's going to have many layers of these dead keratinized cells, epithelial cells that have flattened and no longer have a nucleus. All right, so the layers of the skin from deep to more superficial. You have the stratum basale, or the basal layer of cells that are a single row of cells. You have the stratum spinosum, which is the next superficial most layer. There are many layers of these cells that have nuclei that are centrally located and oval shaped. And this is where your body is going, or the cells are going to start producing keratin fibers and starting to look more flattened. Superficial to that, you have the stratum granulosum, the grainy layer of cells. These cells will have even more keratin. The keratin fibers will shrink together and start looking like grains, especially if you have a really good microscope, you'll be able to see it. Not all, you won't always be able to see it, but know that they have seen that. And the nuclei will start to shrivel up as they move closer and closer to the surface and the cells start to die. The next layer, the next superficial most layer is on the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand, where you have thicker skin, is the stratum lucidum, or the clear layer. And in these cells, you don't have or you cannot see any of the organelles, any of the nuclei, and no longer can see the cell membrane. And then the superficial most layer is the stratum corneum, or the corny layer of skin, where you have the keratinized dead epithelial cells that are all flat and have no nucleus or other organelles because the cells are now dead and keratinized. So this is what it looks like. So again, all of this is epidermis, and then deep to that is your dermal layer. In the actual microscope image, you have all of this that is epidermis, and then the lighter color is your dermal layers. So deep, you have the basement membrane, so you can't really see it very well here, but know that the deepest layer of the epidermis is sitting on the basement membrane. And then you have the stratum spinosum, I'm sorry, the stratum basally, the basement layer of cells that are going to look more cuboidal, possibly columnar. And this is where your melanocytes are going to live. This is where your cells are going to divide, uh, where your cells are going to divide so that you have newer and newer epidermis all the time. And then these cells are going to move more superficially. So this next layer that is just adjacent to the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum. Superficial to that, you have your stratum granulosum, stratum granulosum. On these images, you can start to see these cells looking a little bit darker. That would show you like the grains of keratin. Superficial to that, if this is a layer of, or if this is located in the palms and soles, if this is thick skin, you have your stratum lucidum. So here it's shown as a layer of clear cells between the stratum granulosum and the stratum corneum. And then the superficial most layer is the stratum corneum, where you have the dead keratinized cells. On the micrograph, you can see the same thing. So you would say that this bottom layer, single layer, is your stratum basale. Now, of course, this is not as easy to see as it is in a drawn picture, but because we know how many cells are in the stratum granulosum, I'm sorry, the stratum basale, we know it's a single layer of cells. So we know that it's going to sit the closest to the dermal layer, and it's going to be associated with the basement membrane. Even if we can't see the basement membrane, we know it's there. So basement membrane, stratum basale, then the stratum spinosum is going to be superficial to that. And then the stratum granulosum is going to be superficial to that. Above that, if this is thick skin, you'll see a clear layer of cells, the stratum lucidum. So here, stratum lucidum. And then superficial to that, most superficial, is your stratum corneum, and that is associated with the outer layer of skin that we can feel when we're touching our skin. when when we're talking about the epidermis, we focus a lot on those stratified squamous epithelial cells, but know that there are other cells also located in and associated with the epidermis, and they have different functions. So you have dendritic cells, which are also called Langerhans cells, and yes, you'll need to know both of them because in science and medicine and anatomy, you will come across, you may come across either name. So dendritic cells or Langerhans cells, you have tactile cells or Merkel cells, and then you have melanocytes. So dendritic cells or Langerhans cells, these cells are going to be found in the stratum spinosum layer, found in the stratum spinosum layer. They are phagocytes. Remember, phago means to eat. So these are cells that eat. These are cells that protect the skin and underlying tissue from infection. So if somehow a bacteria cell, in a viral cell, or some other cell that it wants to infect you, gets into your skin, these dendritic cells are there to recognize them and then to gobble them up to keep you safe. So phagocytic cells located in the stratum spinosum that are keeping you protected from infection. The next cell is the tactile or Merkel cells. These tactile cells are going to be found in the stratum basale. So when we hear tactile, think to touch. So tactile cells have to do with touch. Tactile cells or Merkel cells are sensory nerve endings. Sensory nerve endings. So you will have these sensory nerve endings located in the stratum basale and act as sensory receptors for light touch. So the rest of the tactile cell is going to be in the nerve, in the dermis, but the end of that nerve is going to be in the stratum basale. So it's going to move from deep to superficial or more superficial and be located in the stratum basale. So anytime you have light touch, something brushes against your skin, your shirt sits on your body, a feather touches your skin, all of those are considered light touch. And the reason why we can feel that light touch is because of these tactile cells or Merkel cells located in the stratum basale. Then you have melanocytes. Melanocytes, we already mentioned, are located in the stratum basale, in that basement or the basal layer of stratified squamous epithelium. Melanocytes produce pigment, and the pigment that it produces is called melanin. The functions of melanin there are a few functions. One of them is to absorb UV light from the sunlight. So the sunlight produces ultraviolet rays, and those ultraviolet rays will hit the skin, and the melanin from the melanocytes will absorb that. It also provides the skin with color. So whatever color your skin is from lightest to darkest or from darkest to lightest, that is because of the presence of melanocytes. Melanin is distributed to your keratinocytes in order to protect you from that UV radiation from the sun. Now, once UV rays hit the skin, as those skin cells divide, the stratum basale cells start to divide, they start to grow. That UV light can damage that DNA and it can cause problems. So the melanin of the melanocytes or produced by the melanocytes will start to protect you from that DNA damage caused by the UV light of the sun. It also protects from the UV light from fibroblast damage. Remember, the fibroblasts are cells that build fibers, and it's protecting from skin damage, skin cancer. Anytime you have damage to your DNA, it is possible that those cells with the damaged DNA can become cancerous. A cancerous cell is basically a cell that starts to divide and grow uncontrolled because they no longer have a stop mechanism that tells them when to stop growing and dividing. We're going to stop the video here and we'll continue on the learning more about the epidermis in the next video.